Right. I'm assuming that others will join us as and when. I will begin the meeting. Okay. Um, Now, usually with a meeting, the first item is telling people where the toilets are and what to do if a fire alarm goes off. So all I can say is, if you don't know where your toilets are, then I'm a little worried for you. And if the fire alarm does go off, there's only one of you needs to leave. So can I welcome you all to the first of our planned speaker meetings for 2020-2021. I appreciate there may be some among you who have never experienced the thrills of a Zoom meeting before. So I'd like to congratulate those of you on your courage and perseverance. It can grow on you. And I have to say that without it, we would have been unable to have the conversations which we have had this year. To say 2020 has been a rare year is an understatement of monumental proportions. I must refer to our society AGM. It was impossible to hold the usual gathering, as you appreciate. The society faced a huge challenge. Two principal officers had indicated they did not wish to continue. We had joint chairmen, not provided for under the Constitution, one of which wished to stand down, and one who had far exceeded the time limits allowed under the Constitution. James Wilkie, David Morgan and I, together with Diane Lamb, had been asked by Lancaster Vision to discover what the relationship was between the society and Vision. In the course of our discussions, we were challenged to put ourselves forward for election. On the basis of I will if you will, and so will I, we did so. In the course of a Zoom meeting, we were duly elected. James as your secretary and David as treasurer and membership secretary. Diane became my deputy chair. We were curious about the wording of the Constitution and discovered there were members of the executive who shared our misgivings. Our first task was to draw up health and safety, data protection and diversity policies, and a complaints procedure. Any firm or organization who wishes to be taken seriously must have these written policies, and in some areas they are mandatory. These can now be found on our website. The Constitution was totally out of date. We looked around the country at other civic societies and eventually settled on Salisbury Society, a town of similar size and containing a wonderful collection of heritage properties. With their permission, we adopted it and adapted it to suit our needs. Your executive committee have approved it for submission to yourselves, and you should all have received the draft for your approval and for comment. We have received 2 comments so far. Your executive committee has continued to meet monthly with full agendas. Your officers have had meetings with Civic Voice, Lancashire County Council, Lancashire City Council, our Lancaster MP, the Winter Gardens. These meetings have either been in the guise of the Society or Lancaster Vision. Roger and I have visited the old gasworks in Lower Dolphinholme and the huge water wheel in Quarmer. The Planning Oversight Group have continued commenting on numerous planning applications. These comments are highly valued by the Planning Office, if not by the prospective developers. We were advised by Civic Voice that there is a proposal in front of the Minister of State to make civic societies statutory reviewers of sensitive applications. This is a further reason for needing those policies and procedures. Lancaster Vision is currently pressing the County Council regarding Lancaster's traffic issues. The County Council have emailed us today asking to send us more information. Vision has recently advised the Secretary of State of our opposition to having Lancaster bundled with Blackpool and Clitheroe in a unitary authority. Our preference is a grouping of Lancaster, Kendal and Barrow, which is the City Council's favoured scheme. So your society has not been idle through these difficult days. We will continue to work hard to protect our city. And now to this evening. Our speaker tonight is Owen Hatherley. Owen is the author of several books, including A Guide to the New Ruins of Great Britain, Landscapes of Communism, The Ministry of Nostalgia, and the forthcoming Red Metropolis. He is the culture editor of Tribune. Wikipedia, so it must be true, says that Owen has described himself as a communist, at least in the sense in which the word was used in the Communist Manifesto. He has written that revolution might be a rather exciting thing, one that would transform the world and transform space for the better. Worth doing? Why not try it? In a city as conservative with a small c as Lancaster, that should mean this will lead to an interesting talk. Ladies and gentlemen, Owen Hatherley.
Thank you. I don't generally come to things like this while wearing my hammer and sickle badge. But thanks for flagging that one up. So, yeah, this is an oft delayed talk. I think that was originally going to be in Lancaster, and then it couldn't be because I had to be in Estonia, speaking of that part of the world. And, oh, what's going on here? And now it's happening while you all sit in your living rooms. So the wonders of modern technology. What I'm going to be talking about has nothing to do with communism, except on a very expansive definition. There's probably things in there that the current Prime Minister might consider communist, but that wouldn't have been considered communist at the time. And anyway, Lancaster, you've got one of the only campaign group MPs left of a job. So you are in fact the red base of Lancaster now officially because of Cat Smith. So it's more about the sort of more middling results of left-wing administration in Britain, and particularly about local authority architects. And when we were kind of talking about what we could talk about, that was generally decided to be the best thing to talk about, because it seemed to be an idea which for a very, very long time everyone decided was a bad idea that we should no longer do. I'm going to blow these out because they're making the picture weird. And then it was decided more recently that the market wasn't really giving up the goods. So perhaps, getting local authorities to do things might be a good idea. However, that decision came rather too late for the construction of a track and trace system, as we've seen, where it's all been run by Serco and various similar companies, with the fantastic results we can all see. The idea that local authorities could run something like that, bonkers, crazy. Anyway, so this is kind of about what local authorities did do in terms of buildings over the last roughly 120 years or so. And it's going to be entirely based on things that I think they got right, kind of purely as propaganda, really. Obviously, there are things local authorities got wrong, but you ain't going to hear about them tonight. I'm sure I will hear about them in the comments and in the question and answer afterwards. So what I wanted to start with, which if I can get share screen to work, you will see in a moment, whoops, is this. Everyone can see it?
Yes.
Great. So this is the current state, more or less, of Park Hill in Sheffield, which is a large housing estate constructed in Sheffield in the first couple of years of the 1960s, one of the largest of its time, listed grade 2 about 15 years ago, then kind of sat on and run down for a bit, and then eventually, because depending on who you ask, the general consensus of the council thought they wouldn't be able to afford to maintain it. So it was given, for the usual token, £1, to the property developers Urban Splash. Over the course of Urban Splash's renovation of this building, which began in 2007, it's like 5 or 6 interconnected buildings connected by walkways. 4 stories at the lowest, 14 at the highest. It has a big slope going across it if you've not seen it. So the first thing that they did was took the largest of those blocks, the 14-story one, strip it of everything, strip it right back to its frame, almost inconceivable for a listed building of any other era. Obviously, all the residents were moved out, and by now all the residents of the entire block have been moved out, which is over 1,000 people. And then, after abundant public funding by English Heritage and the Homes and Communities Agency, it was opened as luxury flats, which have sold slowly over the last couple of years, mainly to lecturers at Sheffield University and Sheffield Hallam University. Probably partly because of the convenience of being right next to the railway station. So this building rehoused over 1,000 people who lived in the slum without toilets, without hot water, rehoused a lot of them in 2 years. Currently, it has taken 13 years to turn 1/5 of that building into a block of flats for wealthy people, relatively wealthy people. So when I think of this, I tend to think of a panel I was on once with a guy called Nick Johnson, who was one of the directors, is still, I believe, one of the directors of Urban Splash. And he was asked as part of this panel, which was at the Architects Building Design Partnership, the formerly Preston-based Architects Building Design Partnership in London. And someone in the audience asked, do you think we should have local authority architects again building things? And the guy from Urban Splash responded, I would no more trust a local authority architect to design me a house than I would trust a local authority barber to cut my hair. I thought this was rather cheeky, given that they had taken over and kind of run privately, by that point, 3 quite large council estates designed by local authority architects. But I think it shows quite well the kind of general esteem in which council housing, local authority work, and the kind of work of elected local authorities was generally seen by our betters around roughly about 10 years ago. And I think that's changed over the last 10 years quite gradually, to the point where now, if you said something like that in an architecture event, you would expect to get a bollocking. In 2010, you could say something like that at an architecture event and no one would bat an eyelid. So it was an era where the former Member of Parliament for Salford, Hazel Blears, said that the government didn't trust councils to wash the pots. An era which I think we've never really come out of. So going completely, stretching right back from that and going right back to the 1890s, I am going to go to the next. How do I unshare this? Stop share. I'm going to go on to the next picture, which there's lots of different kind of places one can date local authority housing and local authority architecture to. depending on whether basically you live in London or live in Liverpool. I live in London, so I'm starting it in London. And I'm starting it with the Boundary Estate in Shoreditch, designed by the arts and crafts architect Owen Fleming, who at that point was the principal designer of the first London County Council Architects Department. Now, local authorities kind of having significant powers and having people building stuff on their behalf, or even employees of theirs building stuff, was not new. Well, that was, in many ways, it comes really out of Birmingham in particular, and Birmingham in the 1860s, and lots of you would know this and know your Victorian history. But in terms of like making it something more of a kind of idealistic, if you like it, ideological if you don't, kind of project, it really begins in London, I think. And specifically, it begins with the London County Council's development of a specific building programme from its foundation in 1889 onwards. So the London County Council at that point was one of those sort of strange political hybrids, let's say. It was elected by male and female suffrage in an area really roughly half the size of the current Greater London. So inner London plus Woolwich, basically, if you know London and know Woolwich. Didn't include lots of quite important bits of London, such as East Ham and lots of the docks. But it was most of London as it then existed. And the people running it politically were either from the Liberal Party, which was then the governing party, I think, at the time of its foundation, and from the kind of nascent socialist movement. So the Labour Party hadn't founded at the time of its formation, but many of the people who would later be founders of the Labour Party were elected to the LCC on a kind of Lib Lab ticket. So it was used really by these kind of liberals and Fabians and trade unionists as a sort of experimental site, an experimental way of developing a mixed economy in London, where certain things such as housing, parks, leisure, transport, fire stations, the police, schools, various other things would be taken completely in-house and run by the elected local authority. Again, not new. What was new was the idea that the building projects for that be done by a newly constructed, newly sort of set up works department. The works department did not work with private builders. It paid union rates, and it was widely attacked in the press as a form of communism. It was a particular kind of hate campaign against it from the Times, so some things never really change. And they managed to take the LCC to court eventually for kind of competition grounds because of the high wages that they were paying and the fact that they were cutting out the mainstream construction industry from their buildings. And for the architects at the heart of this department, such as Owen Fleming, this was completely the point. They were disciples of William Morris, disciples of the arts and crafts movement. Most of them were socialists, many of them card-carrying members of the Social Democratic Federation, the small Marxist sect. And for them, the proof was in the pudding. If they could, and if their works department working with them could produce things that were better than what the private market was giving to working class people, they had won the argument as far as they're concerned. So the Boundary Estate is their first and largest housing estate, but there are several. Some of them in this kind of high density manner, kind of large blocks of flats. Lots of the others are more suburban sites in places like Tooting. And they had about 15 years of this kind of very, very kind of high end, kind of very, very high quality housing, which was sort of recognized at the time to be basically as good in many cases as the mansion blocks the wealthy were having built for them in the West End at the time. However, there were certain flaws in all of this. Lots of the people moved out of the slums that these buildings replaced, couldn't afford this housing. A lot of it tended to go to skilled workers and quite sort of stable families rather than to the kind of as would have been said at the time, the lumpen proletariat that were moved off it. I think only about 20 families got rehoused on this estate. The rest just went to some other part of the East End, further east. They then kind of tried to get around this by then building on cheap land on the outskirts in Tooting and Tottenham, Hammersmith and a few other places, by the same architects with a similar level of quality, but with the rents being much cheaper. However, in 1906, they lost the London County Council by a landslide to the Conservatives, who at that point, they didn't stand under their name in London at that point, and stood as the Ratepayers Party, which I think suggests the priorities there. But they continued to build, and they built on quite a large scale. So here's an example of what they did. This is, I believe, although some would, it sort of depends exactly on how you slice it, but this is, I think, the largest housing estate in Western Europe, the largest council estate in Western Europe. And it was built in Dagenham, in the kind of East London, Essex borders, across the 1920s as part of the kind of Homes for Heroes program that followed the First World War. And you can see certain sort of differences in this between what the LCC under the kind of liberal socialist coalition were doing beforehand. It's obviously very, very low density. They've managed to keep a lot of trees from the woodlands that were there before. But you can see that the kind of architectural imagination is kind of dulled somewhat. There are very few places around, like the Boundary Estate. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of places like this, Becontree, across the country. Everywhere has its own Becontree. I lived for a while when I was growing up in a Becontree in my hometown in Southampton, and don't have fantastic memories of it. But they were generally popular. They housed people in stuff that was far better than what they lived in before. And it sort of showed more than anything else the scale at which local authorities could operate. And something like this, they were building practically entire towns while completely cutting out the private market. And doing so to a reasonably high quality, although, as I say, the architecture's a bit boring for my taste. So there's a sort of, starts to be a sort of ideological debate in the 20s and 30s about how to build. So Britain builds probably more local authority housing at that point than anywhere in the world, apart from Vienna, the capital of the then newly founded Republic of Austria. So these kind of Becontree type estates are being built in huge numbers. Some kind of more kind of flat-based stuff gets built in London and Scotland, and to a certain degree in Liverpool, which I'll come to in a second. But a lot of particularly Labour, but not only Labour councillors, start going off on kind of jaunts, start sort of gallivanting around Eastern Europe, and start seeing things that they think, why don't we do this instead? And the one of these that sort of throughout this, the kind of great example, the thing they desperately want to be like if they possibly can, I said there's going to be no communism in this, but I'm clearly lying, was Vienna, and particularly the Karl Marx Hof, which you can see here. So Vienna came out of the First World War from being the kind of capital of a gigantic empire to being the sort of gigantic capital of a small and quite poor country. And the socialist administration, which came to power briefly in the country, but remained in power in Vienna, intended to kind of rebuild on a gigantic scale, kind of match what the sort of problems in housing and the problems in sort of particularly rented housing that had been created during the empire and been created during the war. So from 1919 onwards, you start seeing things like this spring up. So huge, high-density blocks of flats, usually on a kind of conventional street pattern, so kind of like a 19th century block structure, but usually with these big courtyards in between, one of which you can see here. And those courtyards, as well as being filled with trees and the usual sort of stuff, were filled with things that in Britain, local authorities were not very good at. So started having sort of integrated into the buildings polyclinics and schools and bathhouses and sports centres. And all of these sorts of things, which generally had kind of come as an afterthought for the housing in Vienna, was kind of built in from the start. This was funded via very high taxation, particularly by a thing called the luxury tax, which, needless to say, wasn't very popular with people in Vienna that were consuming luxuries. But what the thing was probably most unpopular with was landlords. And landlords became the backbone for the Austrian Catholic Social Party, who, after a fashion, ended up seizing power, kind of launched a coup in Vienna in 1934, and after about a week's worth of fighting, literally besieged these buildings, which are reckoned to be kind of fortresses or castles of the proletariat, literally besieged them and bombarded them. And by that point, you know, that little project was over. Among the people who watched this was a young Kim Philby, who whose politics, as he always put it, was shaped by watching this event. Anyway, but lots, sort of in the previous 10 years, sort of around the country, you know, this had been like a place of pilgrimage for councillors and kind of housing experts and enthusiasts. And one of the first results, interestingly, comes in the Tory council at that point of Liverpool. People in Liverpool don't like to be reminded of this. Next one. No, it's not that one. There you go. So this, like most of the kind of high density blocks of flats built in Liverpool in the 30s, most of them either got demolished, and those which have remained because they were listed have been turned into student flats. So this has been student flats, I think, since the late 80s. This is St Andrew's Court, I think it's officially called, but everyone in Liverpool calls it the Bullring. And this is modelled very, very closely on these Viennese estates. Very, very kind of grandiose, kind of slightly bombastic, monumental housing with a kind of public courtyard in the middle, which we never really seem to do as well over here. Then the kind of trees and public facilities which they had never really had to the same extent, although you can see that in the renovation in the 80s, some of these little kind of public spaces for the students were added. They don't take kindly, the owners and security guards of this building, upon people coming to take pictures of it, I found. But in Liverpool, there's kind of these ideas coming from Red Vienna were deployed mainly on a sort of semi-sectarian basis, particular estates for Protestants or Catholics, usually in order to keep dock workers close to the centre. So whereas in other cities like Manchester, when it was building Wythenshawe, a huge kind of Becontree style estate in Wythenshawe, rather than kind of building kind of low-rise cottage housing, Liverpool went in mainly for these huge blocks so that you could still have a casual dock labour force that could walk to the docks and back. But you have this kind of first idea there that maybe there are kind of other ways of looking at things based on how local authorities are acting in the rest of the world, and particularly in the rest of Europe. And after kind of Vienna, the kind of main kind of example which people were enthusiastic about was either Frankfurt or Berlin. And whereas your Viennese council housing had this kind of still almost kind of Victorian sense of monumentality and drama and ornament and sculpture and so on, what was happening in Berlin and Frankfurt was very, very different. It was very, very modern. It had flat roofs. it kind of broke with previous planning history. You were kind of putting buildings in parks, putting buildings in gardens, rather than kind of arranging them alongside a street. And the kind of means of sort of designing and painting and planning buildings came from these kind of ideas that came often from abstract art and abstract sculpture. And you can see that especially here in the so-called forest estate in the suburbs of Berlin, designed for a trade union building society by the local authority architect Martin Wagner and the expressionist architect Bruno Taub. These are all now UNESCO listed. They're all very popular, and when one of them goes in the private market, which isn't often, they go for a lot of money. So kind of after the war, this kind of new German style starts to be kind of imported into the UK. Probably the Festival of Britain is one of the real turning points for this. In 1951, kind of the soon-to-be outgoing Labour government has this kind of grand sort of celebration of modernity, equality and futurism and so on the south bank of the Thames. This is the largest surviving part of this, the Royal Festival Hall. And among the designers of this were often people who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So the main designers of this were Robert Matthew and Leslie Martin, one of them Scottish, one of them English, alongside Peter Morrow, who had been an exile from Nazi Germany. So these there starts to be more of a kind of strongly modernist, sort of futuristic kind of vein in local authority architecture from this point. And this is really where a lot of people kind of part their ways with local authority architecture. A lot of people start to kind of be suspicious of it, and there starts to be, that's where the kind of "I wouldn't trust one to cut my hair" comment comes from, I think. For me, it's probably the most interesting thing that happens, but some may disagree. So next one I'm going to move on to is two estates, one in London, one in Sheffield, which I think show the sort of things, the sort of ways that local authority architects and local authority planners were kind of thinking in the immediate post-war years, and the kind of things that were going on in their minds. So this is the Alton estate, which is on, which is built, and this is really the most important thing about it for me, is built on the land of 4 country houses. So London County Council bought up this land, presumably compulsory purchase, probably at quite a low fee. Those were the days, and proceeded to build a gigantic council estate in what had been the rolling countryside between the big house and the other big houses. So some of the green spaces in this are designed by the garden designer Capability Brown. It must be the only council estate whose grounds are designed by Capability Brown, but I might be wrong about that. And in order to keep as much of that, as much of those gardens as possible, most of the Alton estate built high. So most of it, although not all of it, is in either kind of mid-rise maisonettes of about 6 stories or in high-rise towers of about 12 stories, 2 of which you can see here. And in front of it, one of the statues from the original grounds, which are kind of dotted about the place. This was described at the time by one American critic as the finest low-cost housing development in the world. Those that like 1960s film will know it as the place where the books are burned in Fahrenheit 451. But this is real life, not films. So I think it's generally considered to have been quite a successful estate. It's still very popular with residents. The same isn't, well, it's difficult to say quite the same thing, depending on who you ask, about the other example of this, which I think kind of continues this idea of taking the grounds of kind of middle class and upper middle class houses and building workers' housing in the middle of it. So this, I've taken people to this and seen them gasp as they get to the hilltop to see it. And it's genuinely one of the greatest town planning achievements in British history. And anyone that disagrees with me hasn't been there. So this is Gleedless Valley in Sheffield, a very large estate built by Sheffield City Council Architects Department in the second half of the 50s. So Sheffield's kind of city architect at this point, Lewis Womersley, who's very much an enthusiast for both for modern architecture of the continental variety, but also an enthusiast for capability brown, tries to sort of combine these two. So you expropriate a load of land and you kind of try to keep as much of that land and keep as much of those gardens and keep as much of those trees as possible while building thousands of council flats in the middle of it. I think the result is better than Urban Splash Guy's haircut. This may or may not be a popular view on the estate. I found when talking to people there, you've either got people who've lived there for a very long time, particularly elderly people tend to have a very, very positive assessment of it. Actually, I think comes partly from the fact that they've been familiar with the slum housing that survived in Sheffield until the 60s and 70s, are familiar with kind of poor quality rental housing and so on. Whereas people who've grown up in it and consider it normal tend not to see it as being quite so impressive. But there are people who are very, very passionate about this estate that live there. And there are people who are less passionate about this estate that live there. English Heritage were recently trying to get, Historic England were recently trying to get various post-war landscapes listed. Something which is very unusual in post-war buildings, where usually the idea that the landscaping is part of the project, which is very common with 18th century architecture, let's say, is generally not something they look at. But if they were to list any piece of 20th century landscape, this would be my top pick. So given that this is the Lancaster Civic Society, I feel I ought to talk about at least a little bit about Lancashire, and particularly about the architects department that Lancashire County Council had in the between the kind of 50s and 70s under the direction of Roger Booth. And I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with this. So one of the things that, as someone that knows a fair bit about this stuff, I think, without wanting to kind of blow my own trumpet, I knew nothing at all about Roger Booth's work until I came across it in the magazine, The Modernist, which is put out by the Manchester Modernist Society, a group of mostly quite young Mancs who kind of document mainly modern architecture in the Northwest, but it sort of branched out increasingly to Scotland, the Northeast, the Midlands, just anywhere apart from the South, as far as I can see. They had several articles on Roger Booth's work in Lancashire, and I ended up kind of chasing a lot of these up and getting a good look at them. It seems to have been one of the most creative departments of that time in a local authority. And the fact that it isn't better known is quite strange to me. Only one of Lancashire County Council's buildings under Booth is listed, which I'll come to. There's the one after this. So obviously lots of you will know this. This is Morkan Library. And I think it shows a lot of the kind of qualities of the buildings Roger Booth was doing in Lancashire. That each project is mostly very individual. There's a certain amount of system building, particularly in the police stations, but also there's a sense that each building has to respond to a specific site. And a certain amount of kind of lightheartedness, I think, in the architecture. So here you have this kind of almost origami sort of sense of this kind of little folded, tiny little building with its copper roof, its kind of great big kind of angular roof lights, and this little kind of glass pavilion at the front. with the kind of rough aggregate and the concrete and the concrete on the facades as a sort of, it's a very kind of modest piece of architecture, but I think as a sort of way of building a small library in the kind of corner of a fairly small town, I think it's a very, very successful building. And again, suggests the sort of things that a local authority architect was capable of doing in-house, that rather than kind of like, right, we're going to design a library, so we're going to have a competition, or we're going to get in, you know, the lowest bidder in the kind of best value auction. Instead, we're going to get our people who we employ, who know the area and live in those towns, to design it themselves. And I think the result of that is rather attractive in this case. Next one, obviously, you will know because it's in the University of Lancaster. And this is, I think, the only example I know of a local authority architect working on a university building. So this is Lancashire County Council Architects Department's contribution to the University of Lancaster, built from the 60s onwards. So here you can kind of see this very 60s interest in sort of prefabrication and modularity and looking kind of very space age. This is the sort of stuff that hugely divides opinion. I obviously like it a lot. Many people don't. But you can kind of, one of the interesting things, if you go to this particular bit of the university, which I think was built for, the reason why the county council were working on it was built for the local college, local tech college, rather than for the university, although it was joined onto it. I might be wrong about this, but this is what I remember. So you have it kind of as part of a campus, which otherwise has kind of invited outside architects. And one of the fun things about kind of walking around it is the way that they've kind of combined this very sort of futuristic kind of machine-made style of architecture with kind of very old school college quadrangles. You kind of go through the ground floor of this, and you can kind of get to a courtyard in the very kind of Oxbridge or Durham kind of style. But the only listed building of the Lancashire County Council Architects Department is not this. I've got it in the wrong order, but I'm going to show this anyway because I like it. This is the Fleetwood radar station in Fleetwood, obviously near Blackpool at the far end of the tram. And again, shows the sort of range of what was being done and the kind of range of buildings you were getting. So this, you would get something like a kind of radar station being sort of stuck, being designed by the local authority architect and sort of stuck on the beach in this quite kind of surrealistic way. I'm very fond of this building, but it's quite peculiar, but not as peculiar as, stop share, next one. This one, which actually is listed. The so-called plastic classroom in Preston. So this got listed, I think, actually last year. There were a whole load of post-war schools that were submitted for listing, usually by local enthusiasts of one kind or another. This is one of the strangest British buildings of the 70s, like one of the most genuinely peculiar things built anywhere in this country in the 70s. And it sort of shows how experimental I think local authority architects could be, rather than just being this kind of doer thing of like, right, we build the local library and we build the local council flats and, you know, we do it as cheaply as possible. Instead, there was not just a sense of creativity, but a sense of experiment, that you could kind of play around with new materials, you could kind of have fun with new construction techniques, and you could design it in quite a kind of out there style. This is, you know, even more sort of space age as architecture than the buildings of the college. It's really sort of science fiction type stuff. And obviously it's joined into a primary school, so it's very much the kind of thing that works very well in a primary school, you know, on a very, very small scale, and the kind of obviously designed to kind of encourage sort of the imagination and dreaming in kids in Preston who Otherwise, one could possibly argue there's not that much dreaming and imagination to be had in Preston, but I couldn't possibly comment. So another example of this, I think one of the most kind of interesting and creative departments was Norwich. And Norwich is a really hard place to find kind of interesting modern architecture until you realize that's because they hide all of it. So when you go around the center of Norwich, you can go around, if you know, should one ever go to Norwich, when you're not kind of looking at the cathedral and the kind of, you know, the various medieval churches that are left around the center of Norwich, you can frequently turn around an alleyway and you find something like this. So Norwich built a huge quantity of in-house council housing in the 50s and 60s and 70s under its city architect, David Percival. And they sometimes get with sort of invited architects working under his direction, but sometimes just purely in-house. And they kind of change over time in a really interesting way. And you can walk around certain estates in Norwich and just kind of watch them change bit by bit as you kind of go one to the other. So they sort of start off, you know, kind of flat roofs, walkways, concrete. Then they kind of start to soften up a bit. And then by the 70s, they start to look like this. So kind of villagey, and if one likes that kind of thing, very, very much in keeping with the medieval city. But usually with these kind of very ingenious little plans with sort of walkways and sort of odd bits of stairs and courtyards in order to fit loads and loads of housing in to the kind of odd leftover spaces of a medieval town. So it's a really interesting city to go to for stuff like that. And I will come back to it at the end. But it sort of shows, I think, the way that, you know, even in quite a kind of historic city, you could do fun things. However, probably lots of, and this is where I have to come clean, lots of my kind of enthusiasm for local authority architecture comes from growing up in Southampton. And Southampton, if you ever go to Southampton, the first thing you notice when you leave the railway station is this, which is right outside. This was listed in 1997 when I was 16. I remember very well the local press having these kind of endless articles and letters pages of like, why have they listed that fucking eyesore? Obviously, I was delighted. They managed to list it even after the UPVC windows you can see here were put in. Usually a UPVC kind of infection means that a building doesn't get listed, but English Heritage, as was, decided that the quality of the building was so strong that they would let it be listed despite the PVC windows. That was also the last time it was cleaned. There is this very strange idea that you can't clean concrete. I don't know where people get this from. You can, in fact, clean concrete. The fact that this looks like this after having not been cleaned in 23 years, I think is quite impressive. But anyway, but this, I think, it's a sort of another facet of, I think, what the kind of interesting side of local authority architecture, that it was considered very much a sense, as a sort of source of civic pride that you would sort of display to visitors. So you could see that with the kind of first example at Park Hill in Sheffield, that it's right outside the station. That just, and because it's on that hill, you can see it everywhere you go in Sheffield. And the famous thing that people in Sheffield say, kind of jokingly, of like, you know, built on 7 hills like Rome. The local authority architects department in Sheffield were very aware of that, and they deliberately made sure they put a estate on each hill so that you could see those estates from each other. And so that anyone in Sheffield could see what the most important buildings of that era, of that city, were. I think there's always a kind of rule of thumb that you have of like, if you want to know what a kind of era thinks of as its most important function, what's most important to that society, look at what the buildings are, look at what the tallest buildings in that city actually are. So obviously for most of the last 1,000 years, those have been churches. Currently, they are usually luxury flats or office blocks for banks. But in this era, the most prominent buildings in many cities, including my own, were council housing. And that's very much the case of this, that it was supposed to be this kind of grand statement as soon as you get here of like, this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is what we're proud of. And I think that's obviously something we could learn from. But the most kind of famous example of local authority architecture in my hometown is actually this. I'll leave this with you as I get a glass of water. Hold on. So this is a couple of a certain age enjoying the view from the Royal Victoria Country Park on the outskirts of Southampton of the Fawley Esso oil refinery. I think that's what they're looking at. I don't see any evidence otherwise. And what they're sitting on is a Southampton bench. And Southampton City Architects Department, when they weren't kind of building libraries and schools and housing, had developed a form of concrete bench, which has this sort of gently kind of cast concrete, and it has this sort of slightly kind of upturned supports for wooden benches, which then kind of get nailed onto it. Very, very simple design, very easy to produce. If you've got a bit of concrete, got some wood, you can make one. And it was picked up all over the country. I take great pleasure in going to other cities and towns and seeing Southampton benches in them. And you can still frequently buy, if you look online, you can still buy this design as a Southampton bench. And I don't think at any point the local authority copyrighted this. If they had, they could probably have made a lot more money from it than they have from trying to convince people to go to a museum about the Titanic. But anyway, but I think this sort of, again, sort of shows the kind of versatility of that particular moment, and how something kind of cooked up in, you know, in the town hall of a quite small city could end up spreading everywhere. I've found Southampton benches in Poland, which I'm enormously pleased about. So throughout the 70s, there starts to be a kind of criticism of this stuff as architecture and of the stuff as planning. And initially, that critique is met within your local authority architects departments, rather than it being about sort of dismantling them. It was something which councils kind of felt, okay, we can accommodate that critique, we can change how we work, and this is what we'll come up with. So the last local authority architects department to really, I think, be taken seriously, to have their buildings reviewed in the press, to kind of be written about in the newspapers, to be to really kind of hire first-rate architects, was Hampshire County Council, which is kind of weird, given that most local authority architecture tends to be sponsored by cities and by, in the case of Lancashire, by quite sort of industrial and urban areas. Quite why it happened in Hampshire is quite hard to work out. The head of Hampshire's City Architects, of Hampshire's County Architects Department, Colin Stansfield Smith, was an ex-cricketer, and I think just kind of had like a certain kind of gift of the gab. I think he'd somehow convinced all of these people that this was a really great thing for Hampshire to have, and it still has it. Still has its county architects department, one of the last in the country, and they still do reasonably good stuff. They did a library in Alton, in a kind of quite swanky Hampshire town in the north of Hampshire a few years ago, which got reviewed in The Guardian and everything. Most of what they did, though, was in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and consisted of new schools and sometimes old people's homes and libraries and civic buildings of various kinds for the suburban sprawl that kind of stretches between Portsmouth and Southampton, which kind of fade into each other, Leeds and Bradford style. So there's not really a join, usually because of these little towns that were mostly built in the 60s. And they were initially built without any real facilities, and then the county council kind of built them. So this is the Crestwood School in a suburb of a suburb of a suburb of Southampton. And initially, this kind of arcade that you can see here was supposed to be both part of the school and part of a kind of community centre that anyone could use. And obviously changes in ideas of security and safeguarding in the schools have changed that somewhat over the years. But it's still, I think, quite quite an attractive building, and a few of the Hampshire County Council departments buildings have been listed in recent years. The big library in Chandler's Ford, which I've not put on here because I don't like it, was one case in point. But even within the most kind of interesting examples, there was certain kind of, I think, belief that sort of collapsing confidence, let's say, that the best thing that you could do was probably just not really design anything at all. And one of the kind of most interesting but incredibly unusual and unrepeatable examples of this, but kind of just so sort of weird and of itself that it's just worth talking about, was a program of self-built housing embarked upon by the London Borough of Lewisham's Borough Architects Department in the 80s. Again, there's the kind of Berlin connection. So the architect who devised this, Walter Siegel, was another emigre from Nazi Germany and a committed socialist, but very much of the kind of libertarian sort, kind of one of those on the boundary between anarchism and communism type people. And he had devised a system of building via kind of mass-produced, easily obtainable wooden parts that you could get in any kind of garden centre, where people could build their own housing. And this Siegel system, so-called, then came to make up several estates in Lewisham, a few in London Borough of Greenwich, and then sort of gradually a few others in other parts of the country, although they're quite rare. And this is kind of really where local authority architecture ends, in a way. In the early 80s, funding for this sort of thing is cut very, very heavily. The right to buy council housing is brought in. Rate capping is brought in, limiting what councils can raise in local taxes. Compulsory tendering is brought in, which basically crushes local authority architects departments and direct labour organisations. And that's kind of the end of the story, in a way. And there's a sort of successful attempt to just crush this sort of stuff, because it was regarded by the government at the time as being socialistic and, depending on how fanciful you were, being totalitarian or whatever. But I think more kind of honestly, they just felt it was an interference with the free market, and nothing was really to be allowed to interfere with the free market. So as a kind of quick example of the sort of things that were happening to local authority architecture in the last 20 years, one example which always struck me, partly because it's the one place where I tried to get on the council waiting list, sat on it for several years and never got a flat, was in the London Borough of Lewisham again. And this is the Pepys estate, built by the Greater London Council in the late 60s, retained various Victorian buildings, which you can see in the front, built right on the Thames. It was sort of controversial in various ways. It was quite kind of monumental. By the time it was built, the stuff had fallen out of fashion. But it had a kind of highly praised, at the time, regeneration in the 2000s and 2010s, which entailed taking the green spaces that were between the buildings and filling them with new flats, demolishing the walkways that connected the buildings and connected them to the local Deptford Park, and selling the tower you can see there in the foreground to private investors. Obviously, they sold the tower closer to the river, obviously. And there was a documentary about this a few years ago called The Tower, that kind of followed the lives of the people that live in the surrounding estate, with those that had just bought flats for £1 million in the formerly council tower in the front. And this was really kind of considered the state of the art. This was considered as good as you can get. Rather than building new council housing or preserving the old, instead you were going to sell it off, build new flats, some of them for housing associations, some of them not. And this was to be how you would sort of improve them, by kind of eviscerating them, basically. And then I think because that was so obviously not a great idea, given the scale of the housing crisis in a lot of cities, there's been a return to councils building. So this, again, in Norwich, is my last slide, and is it seems in a way like a kind of return to the kind of qualities of local authority building. So it's council housing, just unambiguously council housing. There's no like, some of it is shared ownership or any of that sort of stuff that we usually get. It's just straight up council housing for people on the local authority waiting list. Built to quite a high quality. There's no kind of private finance initiative or similar sort of skullduggery in there. It's just kind of properly built out of brick and tile, as you can see, in an architecture which kind of combines some of the kind of more kind of early 20th century ideas about sort of streets and street scale with the kind of more modern, more slightly abstract design of the post-war era. If you kind of compare it with a lot of the architecture that Norwich was doing in the 70s, it's actually quite similar. It sort of almost feels that they've just kind of picked up a thread and gone with it. So on that level, it's all very admirable, and it won the Sterling Prize last year for Best Building by British Architect, by the architects Michael Riches, who are a person called Michael and a person called Riches, I believe. I think the big difference with it is largely that it's not done by a local authority architect, because again, there is no local authority architects department. So there's this kind of recognition that the private market can't do everything, that a housing crisis is happening, and that probably the place you would go to for expertise is a local authority rather than to some giant planning consultancy or a big architecture firm or some sort of enormous outsourcing company or what have you. And these were usually the people that got most building done in the last 20 years. So that obviously is a very kind of welcome development. But there's still not really the money or the infrastructure or the kind of expertise in place that's really to be done in-house as intensively as it was done for, I think, about kind of 80, 90 years, from the 1890s until the 1980s. But I think it's quite positive, at least, that this is starting to happen, and there's starting to be a kind of recognition that this is a problem and this is a means of solving it. So in a way, one can kind of look at it quite optimistically if one pretends that the recent planning bill that was passed hadn't been passed, because I think that makes a lot of it incredibly difficult to do. But that's another story for another time. So thank you for listening to all of this. Stop here.
Thank you, Owen. Plenty of food for thought. We'll take questions. You've all been muted, so if you've got a question, can you stick something in the air so that David can allow you to speak? Groovy Rainbow.
Under the name of Peter Rive. You've referred to the extent to which local authority architects were dependent on local authority housing to keep them going, which is true of district councils, rather less true of county councils. But surely a lot of the problem is that if without housing to keep you going, you're dependent on big projects, and big projects come all at once, and then you get a slack period when you haven't got very much to do. And that made them a very attractive candidate for outsourcing to the private sector. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's a bit more complicated?
I think that's one of the reasons. I think it's a consequence rather than a cause, but it's definitely one of the things that's going on. So once kind of housing was basically taken out of their hands in the first half of the 80s, it was very hard to justify them. And when there were cuts happening in local authorities, which there obviously were throughout kind of cities and towns at that point, it was very easy to kind of go, well, get rid of the architects department. Because what was it doing at that point? And that's one reason why Hampshire is the place which keeps doing it, because Hampshire had pots of money. So yeah, there was no problem there.
Can I add a footnote?
Okay.
During my career as a local authority planner in the 1970s, I worked for Durham County Council, and they did have their own in-house barber. So I've had my hair cut by a local authority barber.
That That's brilliant. I'm going to remember this.
Howard.
Hi, Owen. Thanks for a brilliant talk. I was wondering whether the trend for local authorities to set up their own housing companies might be helpful in being able to direct public housing projects.
Yeah, definitely. But it's and it's a step forward. I think it's a step forward, but they've still not really got the expertise. So they tend to get in outside architects, and if you are, you know, with like a London Borough or with Norwich or what have you, they tend to have the money and the wherewithal and the knowledge to kind of go, oh well, we know which architects are good, we'll get them to do it. If you go and see recent council housing in Birmingham, who built a little bit in the last few years, it's terrible because they've got no idea. So they've got exactly the same kind of lowest common denominator stuff that they would have got from Barratt Homes. So it's definitely a kind of step in the right direction, and it's kind of a way of getting it out from under the nose of the government, who I think otherwise would come down on it like a ton of bricks. But it causes, it still doesn't nurture that kind of in-house expertise that was so crucial.
Yeah, thanks.
James? You've been muted.
You need to unmute, James.
Right, should be able to hear
Better.
me.
Can you start again, James?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you, Owen. That was a really interesting run through. Now, clearly, it was given, and the clue was in the title of it, local authority architecture.
Yeah.
But what struck me was the fact that local authority architecture didn't sit in a bubble. It was influenced by a whole range of other things in terms of the social pressures of the time and the economic pressures at the time. And one of the things I've always found very interesting is the degree of criticism that's been levelled at local authority housing. Mm. Now, I've got to declare a vested interest here because I was brought up in a local authority flat. And prior to that, myself, my mother and my father, my two siblings, were living in Glasgow in what was known as a room and kitchen, sharing a toilet, no bath, but a toilet with two other families. But actually, the change in our quality of life to moving to a local authority flat was beyond belief. And too often, I think now, we judge some of that housing by our contemporary values and contemporary standards. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that very often the product of local authority architects was very much directed or nudged by central government policy. Yeah. So, as you will know, one of the reasons we ended up with so many tower blocks was that the grant system for local authority housing was much more lucrative for the local authority if, in fact, they built that or built system building. So, I thought, you know, your lecture was really very, very interesting. And I'll just end on the thing about looking to the future. I mean, I've spent my whole life working in local authorities. Like a previous colleague, I was a planner. And one of the things I witnessed was so many talented architects exiting the local authority because basically they couldn't see any prospect for them to develop their career. And I think I'm not optimistic about rebuilding that capacity, I have to say. I am optimistic about local authorities getting back in to the business of building houses, but I doubt whether we'll see a return to local authority architects, but I may well be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, in a lot of places there really isn't the money, I think, as well. And so that's the thing, particularly for architects who have certain expectations. Although I think in the next few years, there'll be so little work that like anyone that's offering, you know, anything, whether it's designing benches, will you know, be quite a good option for architects that would otherwise kind of be hoping to work with BDP or whatever. So I think that's true. But I think the kind of point about central government is really so important, that it was always just this kind of football that was kicked around. And if you were lucky, you were in a period in which central government kind of generally, you know, threw money at it and let it do what it wanted. And then you had kind of moments like the mid-60s and the early 80s, when either it kind of go, well, great, we'll give you loads of money if you do this, or in the early 80s where it was like, we will crush you. So I think in both cases it kind of succeeded or fell on that. The last government, the one that ended last summer, talked quite a lot about rebuilding council housing, and they got rid of the borrowing cap, which made it so prohibitive for councils to do. From my knowledge, the current government are trying their hardest to close that loophole. But I think quite a lot kind of rushing into that space in between. And I've kind of always been interested because I think it's a bit, not quite sure if it's good or bad, like these things like public practice, which is very big in London boroughs, of kind of architects that previously were doing quite fancy work, kind of signing up to do slightly kind of pro bono work in local authorities. And that's really good to kind of see in a way, but I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the people driving that are developers in order to kind of get a kind of development spokesperson within the local authority. So I think there's kind of lots of push and shove, but I think it's the first time in ages that something's happening other than it just being destroyed. So take it where you can find it.
Looking at my screen, I see 5 people who are in the meeting but not visible. Claire and David, Jay Thomas, who I know is the mayor, Arton, Amy and John Angus. If you have questions to ask, we'll really need to see the colour of you. Claire and David, again, we can see the top of your heads. Thank you. Anyone else going to step forward and show themselves? And do you have any questions? I've got a wave there from Martin.
It's a wave from me several times.
Sorry? Roger, have we missed you?
Yes.
Sorry, nothing personal. What's your question?
There's a question and a comment. The question is, where is the Alton estate in London?
Roehampton.
Roehampton? No, it's right out in the country, right. And the comment was, I was interested that you sort of ended on the tower in the Peaks estate, yeah. Near where I worked for many years. And obviously it's fairly soon to decide whether that's a success, what they've done to sell it off to wealthy people from abroad. But nearer to home, where I worked in Preston, we had the Avenham estate, which was a council estate built in the 60s. Absolutely appalling. You had to be a probation officer doing home visits, you had to have a piece of string which you tied to a tree and then to find your way out of it, because the numbering was totally illogical and the crime was appalling. They eventually sold it to the 2 big tower blocks to private developers, and that seems to have reduced the amount of crime. It doesn't eliminate it, it's reduced it considerably. But that was sort of not far from the classroom, the hexagonal classroom. But as for the Roger Booth Morkan Library, a more dismal place you couldn't imagine. And the police stations they built were gross. I mean, look at the one we've got in Lancaster, a horrible thing like a sort of spaceship with a tower on the top of it. And it had to be redesigned several times because it wasn't fit for purpose. They took away the staircase to the town hall, towards the town hall, and they had to redesign all the cells at the back. And the one in Preston, I think they pulled it down, haven't they? It was just so awful, and it was horrible to work in. The vertiginous steps down to the cells below the magistrates' court were hideous. You talk about going down, it really was awful. And it was so brutalist and totally unthinking about the people who have to work there or visit there compulsorily.
You'll find if you talk to pretty much anyone interested in architecture under the age of 45, they will disagree with you on every single point. So a lot of some of that's bad construction, some of it's fashion. I think the library's great. I think some of the police stations are grim on that. Other than that, I will have to agree to disagree. On the Pepys estate, the crucial issue for that for me was the fact that the area in question had still has a profound housing shortage. It has a very high council waiting list, and it has a lot of people living in overcrowded and unsafe and insanitary housing. It has a large quantity of beds and sheds. It has people crowded into flats above shops. It has formerly council flats that are kind of let to, that are owned by private landlords that are frequently extremely overcrowded. To take a tower block in a fairly successful estate, which had a fairly low rate of crime, and with buildings for structurally
crime.
A low level of crime, mate. I lived over the road from it.
Well,
I lived around there for 8 years. Like, by the 2000s, the Pepys estate had a low level of crime. A lot of the way people talk about modern architecture of the 70s, a lot of the way people talk about the modern architecture of the 70s is remembering the levels of crime in the 1970s. But the levels of crime in most of those places have gone down year on year for a long time. And the Pepys estate was not an unsafe estate in the 2000s. I can say that because I lived opposite. And at that point, I was living in a bedsit above a pizza place where pretty much anyone in there, if you'd offered them a flat in the Pepys, would have gone to it like a shot. So to then take one of those 3 towers and give it to private developers in a city that had huge demand for affordable housing, in an area that had huge demand for affordable housing, just seemed to me an act of blindness, to put it mildly. And that's my main feeling on that.
Okay. John Rolfe, you had your hand. You've been muted.
You have to unmute yourself, John.
Thank you.
There you are.
If you'd drawn into your talk listed structures rather than concentrating on housing, would you have the same sort of things to say? I'm talking about bridges, road junction designs. Is it all the same? Because that would point to architects, wouldn't it, rather than, or would that still be pointing to fashion?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Okay. Well, all your slides and examples were really of dwellings.
Yeah.
And I understand that. But the country is stuffed with listed structures, not just buildings. And they've all required architects or things like that. I just wondered if the sort of things you were saying about the architectural influences on the examples you'd chosen would relate to other county council business.
That's a very good question. In terms of and that's in terms of buildings that are listed or preserved, or just in terms of what we're building?
It is. I bet, I think you'd still be saying, well, that's great too, but that's not listed, but it's jolly interesting.
I mean, there's plenty of it.
Motorways.
Yeah, but generally not as much of it, I don't think. I think of local authority designed bridges that are listed. Quite a lot in London. Things like Chelsea Bridge and so on, I think is an LCC design of the 30s.
Okay.
I think there's one in Winchester, actually. There's a few. I'd have to go to the big book. I'd have to go to the big Elaine Harwood book and look through.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably rarer. So I think anything that was kind of dramatic, kind of big span bridges or, kind of things like the sort of Severn Bridge or what have you, would have gone to big engineering firms.
Yeah. And what about Preston Bypass?
Pardon?
What about Preston Bypass as the almost first motorway?
Yeah, that would, I don't actually know, but I'd be surprised if that wasn't one of the big engineering firms.
Okay.
Cheryl.
Thank you.
Hi, that was really interesting, Owen. Thank you. That's really stimulating thoughts and talks. I just wondered why you felt we get outdoor space and communal areas so terribly wrong in the UK, whereas it seems to me, and especially in Europe, they seem to get it so terribly right.
Yeah, I mean, there's things like, there's particular London estates of the 30s where you can literally kind of see the building in Vienna or Amsterdam they're ripping off. And you can just compare it like with like, and you can go, well, Vienna's example, you'll have like, you know, benches and planting and flower beds. And by and large, in the London example, you won't have, and you won't have had it at the start. If you do have it, it'll have been put there recently. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's, I mean, my guess is Protestantism. I don't know. I suppose the Dutch have that as well. There seems to be a general kind of idea that you sort of did the bare minimum on that sort of thing, and then you stopped. And after that, it was non-essential stuff, and then the budgets got cut. There's plenty of exceptions, and that's why I talked so much about the stuff that was built around gardens. But it's definitely rarer here than anywhere else nearby.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, you've been muted. Bottom, oh, there you are.
I just wanted to refer to what Owen said about the work of Roger Booth in Lancashire, because I was involved with County College on the campus of Lancaster University, which was pictured on your slides. It's a pretty fine building, I think. I must say, for student accommodation, it had the bigger advantage of being very solidly built indeed. So students could bring in huge stereos, and it didn't disturb their neighbours because the building is so heavy. But what I just wanted to mention was that the university, for a while, was demolishing all its old buildings and building new ones, which, frankly, I didn't think were very good, and I still don't think so. And there was a danger that County College would be demolished. But a group of students opposed this because they very much liked living in the building, partly because it was so quiet, but also I think because it was interesting. And the other thing that they liked was that there were huge communal kitchens and bathrooms. So this was a bit unusual because the university was moving towards individual bathrooms en suite, which I think is a negation of college life, actually. That people should share bathrooms and kitchens, not just go and hide away. But that's the way it's all moved since. So I think Roger Booth did a good job in Lancashire, and particularly in that building on Lancaster University campus. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
My pleasure. I do find this, I mean, I wasn't exaggerating for effect. I find that people in their 20s and 30s tend to really like that stuff and tend to contrast it a lot with the very flimsy stuff that's built now quite positively. But yeah, the shared lose is a more controversial issue.
I'm not in my 20s and 30s, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think we'll go there.
But as in the students going like, oh, we want to keep it. I thought you find that a lot of kind of like, we've got to get rid of this thing. And then you have people kind of working and going like, why?
Yes. I think we have run out of hands. So I'd like to, on behalf of the Civic Society, thank you, Owen. A very interesting, stimulating talk. It's certainly generated well, at least one heated comment, and it's good to generate a debate. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, I'm not sure how we can attempt to applaud. I'm not sure what you'll actually hear. But, thank you. Right. Well, I think that has worked very well as an experiment in Zooming. It's we have a next meeting in November. David, can you say
Yeah,
who that is?
we have the lady Anne from Age UK, Lancashire, and they're coming out with all their new things for the winter. So she's going to appraise us of everything that's going to be available and all the help that they can offer around the area.
Oh, well, that might be very useful.
Yeah.
And cheers, Owen. Thank you. December, I'm giving you a talk on the ghosts of Thurnham Hall. So we can hopefully you'll enjoy that. I never believed in ghosts until I started going to Thurnham giving my talk. So we'll see what you think at the end of it.